The council chamber on Nexus Prime was filled with representatives from 347 different species. The massive circular room floated in the center of the station, surrounded by transparent walls that showed the stars beyond. Each species had their own section, arranged by the order they had joined the galactic community. The humans sat in Section 293. A relatively new addition to the ancient gathering, Commander Lisa Grant stood at the human podium, her uniform crisp and her expression calm. She had delivered hundreds of speeches in this chamber over the past 5 years. The humans were known for their constant communication, always eager to share, always ready to talk. They filled the galactic networks with their music, their stories, their scientific discoveries, and their endless questions. Some species found it charming. Others found it exhausting. Today would be different. Lisa looked across the vast chamber and began to speak. Her voice was steady and clear, translated instantly into 346 different languages by the station's systems. She told the council that humanity had made a decision. Earth and all its colonies would be implementing something called the Deep Silence Protocol. Effective immediately, all human transmissions would cease. All communication channels would close. All diplomatic exchanges would end. The protocol would remain in effect for an indefinite period. She did not explain why. She did not ask for permission. She simply stated the facts, thanked the council for 70 years of cooperation, and walked out of the chamber. The other human delegates followed her in perfect silence. Their footsteps echoed in the stunned quiet of the room. For exactly 47 seconds, nobody spoke. Then the chamber erupted into chaos. The Vrex delegation, tall reptilian warriors covered in dark scales, began to laugh. Their leader, War Chief Zenth, stood and declared that the humans had finally realized they were too weak to compete in galactic affairs. The Quillen merchants, small furry beings with 6 arms each, chittered among themselves about the new economic opportunities. The Zephyron collective beings, made of pure energy contained in crystalline forms, hummed with satisfaction at the promise of less noise in the galaxy. Only a few voices expressed concern. Ambassador Khalees of the Loran people, a species known for their wisdom and peaceful nature, raised her hand to speak. The Loran looked almost human, except for their silver skin and completely black eyes. Kellis warned that humanity's silence might not be weakness, but strategy. She reminded the council that humans had a saying about still waters running deep. Her words were dismissed as overcaution. The council session ended with a general agreement that humanity's withdrawal was ultimately harmless. Let them sulk in their corner of the galaxy. Let them discover that isolation would only make them weaker. The galaxy would continue without them. Within 6 hours, every human transmission stopped. The constant flow of human entertainment broadcasts that had filled subspace channels went dark. The trade networks that human merchants used fell silent. The scientific journals that human researchers published ceased. The colonial administration signals blinked out one by one. Even the automated beacons that human ships use for navigation stopped responding to queries. The galaxy had never been so quiet in the days that followed. Various species tried to contact humanity. The Quillen sent trade offers with increasingly favorable terms. The academic circles of the Tauran species, beings who valued knowledge above all else, sent requests for continued scientific exchange. The Vrex sent what they considered a diplomatic message, though it was mostly threats wrapped in formal language. Nothing received a response. Human ships continued to move through space, but they had changed. Every vessel now operated under strict protocols. When other ships approached, the humans would simply jump away to faster-than-light travel without acknowledgement. When stations tried to hail them, the humans would dock, conduct their business in complete silence using only data transfers, and leave. Human colonies could be observed from orbit, their cities clearly functioning, their agricultural systems working, their industries operating. But every attempt to communicate was met with sophisticated jamming technology that blocked all signals. The VARCs were the first to test human resolve with force. 3 months after the silence began, War Chief Zenth ordered a battle group to seize a human mining facility in the Helios sector. The sector had been disputed territory for years, and the Vrex assumed that isolated humanity would be easy prey. 20 Vrex warships approached the mining station, their weapons charged and their warriors ready. The battle lasted 17 minutes. The humans did not attempt to negotiate. They did not send warnings. They did not demand surrender. They simply opened fire with a precision that shocked the Vrex commanders. Every human shot hit a critical system. Every human missile found its target. Every human tactical decision was perfect, as if they had fought this exact battle 1,000 times before. The Vrex warships fell one after another, their shields overwhelmed and their hulls breached. Only one automated escape pod survived, programmed to return to Vrex space with sensor logs of the battle. When the logs were analyzed, Vrex military leaders noticed something disturbing. The humans had not fought with the passion and creativity they had shown in previous conflicts. There was no bravery, no honor, no warrior spirit. There was only cold mathematical efficiency. They fought like machines, like computers, calculating the most effective way to destroy an enemy. The Vrex had always respected human warriors for their emotional fire. This new human military doctrine was something else entirely. It was terrifying. The incident report reached the Galactic Council within days. Kellis read it carefully and felt a chill run through her silver skin. She had studied human history extensively during her decades as an ambassador. She knew that humans were capable of great warmth and great coldness, often within the same individual. She knew that when humans stopped talking, it usually meant they were planning something significant. She tried again to warn the Council, but her concerns were noted and filed away. 6 months passed. The galaxy continued to function without human chatter, but cracks were beginning to show. The Quillan economy started to suffer as markets realized how much human innovation had been driving certain sectors. The Tauran scientific community published papers noting that the rate of new discoveries had slowed dramatically without human collaboration. Even the Zephyron Collective, who had welcomed the silence, began to notice that something felt wrong. The galaxy was quieter, yes, but it was also somehow emptier. Strange reports began to circulate through intelligence networks. Human ships had been spotted in unusual formations near the galactic rim. Construction activity was detected in deep space, far from any registered human colony. Energy signatures that did not match any known human technology appeared and then vanished before they could be properly analyzed. When investigated, these locations were always empty. With no evidence of what had been there, Ambassador Kellis compiled every report she could find. She created a presentation for the Council, showing patterns in human ship movements, evidence of coordinated activities across vast distances, and projections of what humanity might be capable of if they had spent 6 months focused entirely on internal development. She requested an emergency session to discuss the human situation. Her request was granted, only because the Council had nothing more pressing to address. She stood before the Council and presented her findings. She showed them the data, the patterns, the implications. She argued that humanity had not withdrawn from the galaxy out of weakness or spite. They had withdrawn because they were preparing for something. What that something was, she could not say. But she knew in her heart that the galaxy had made a terrible mistake in how they had treated humanity. The Council thanked her for her diligence and voted to continue monitoring the situation. No action was taken. That night, Kellis stood in her quarters aboard Nexus Prime and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, humanity was doing something in the silence. She thought about human history, about how they had risen from primitive tribal warfare to spacefaring civilization in just a few thousand years. She thought about their capacity for both creation and destruction. She thought about what they might become if left alone to grow without distraction. For the first time in her long life, Ambassador Kellis felt afraid. Captain Paul Henderson brought his ship out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system. The research vessel Arcturus had been gone for 18 months, exploring the regions beyond the galactic rim where few species dared to venture. He had left before the deep silence protocol began, and his crew had no idea what they were returning to. The last communication they had received from Earth Command was a single, encrypted message telling them to maintain radio silence and return home immediately. Paul? stood on the bridge and looked at the tactical display. Something was different. The usual chatter of commercial traffic was absent. The navigation beacons were still active, but they no longer responded to queries. Even the automated weather satellites around Earth had stopped broadcasting their standard data streams. His communications officer tried every channel they had used before departure. Nothing came back except a single E-type beam transmission with coordinates and a docking authorization code. The crew was nervous. They had heard nothing from families, friends, or colleagues for 6 weeks since receiving the recall order. Paul kept his expression calm, even though his own heart was racing. He had been a captain for 12 years and had learned that crews needed to see confidence in their commander. He ordered the ship to proceed to the coordinates, which led them to a military station in orbit around Mars that had not existed when they left. The station was massive, easily 3 times larger than anything humanity had built before. Its design was strange, with angles and materials that Paul did not recognize from standard Earth engineering. As the Arcturus approached, automated systems took control of the ship and guided it into a docking bay. The entire process happened without a single word from the station. When the docking clamps locked into place, a message appeared on Paul's screen telling him to report to Briefing Room 7 immediately. He left his first officer in charge, walked through corridors that were both familiar and alien. There were other ships in the bay, all of them human, all of them silent. Crew members moved through the station with purpose, but without speaking. Paul noticed that everyone wore updated uniforms with a new insignia he did not recognize. When he reached Briefing Room 7, the door opened automatically. Inside, a woman in an admiral's uniform waited for him. She introduced herself as Admiral Sarah Mitchell, as commander of what she called the Silent Fleet. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She asked Paul if he had maintained radio silence as ordered. He confirmed that he had. She seemed satisfied and told him to sit down because she had a lot to explain and very little time to do it. The Admiral told Paul that the galaxy had changed in the months he had been gone. Humanity had implemented the Deep Silence Protocol as a response to multiple factors that had made continued open communication dangerous. She did not specify what those factors were, only that Earth Command had determined that humanity needed to operate differently. Every human in the galaxy was now following strict protocols about communication, movement, and interaction with alien species. Paul listened as she described how human colonies had consolidated their defenses, how the military had restructured into the Silent Fleet, and how new technologies had been deployed across human space. She showed him tactical reports of the Vrex attack on the mining station and how it had been handled. She showed him economic data, proving that several alien economies were beginning to suffer without human participation. She showed him intelligence reports about alien species trying to infiltrate human systems and communications. Then she showed him something that made his blood run cold. There were maps of human ship movements over the past 9 months, patterns of construction in deep space, and energy readings from projects that should not have been possible with human technology, except they were possible now. The Admiral explained that humanity had not been idle during the silence. Every resource that had once gone into maintaining diplomatic relations and cultural exchange had been redirected into research, development, and expansion. She told Paul that his ship and crew were being reassigned. The Arcturus would no longer be a research vessel operating independently. It would become part of a network of ships conducting what she called deep observation missions. His job would be to watch the galaxy, to listen without being heard, and to report anything unusual through encrypted quantum channels that alien species could not intercept. Paul asked the question that had been burning in his mind since he entered the room. Why were they doing this? What was the point of cutting humanity off from the rest of the galaxy? The Admiral looked at him for a long moment before answering. She said that humanity had learned a hard lesson over 70 years of galactic contact. Being friendly and open had made them vulnerable. Other species saw human eagerness to share as weakness. They saw human desire for cooperation as naivety. The Vrex mocked them. The Quillen exploited them. Even species that claimed friendship often treated humans as junior partners rather than equals. But there was more to it than wounded pride. The Admiral's expression grew darker as she continued. During the first few months of the silence, when human intelligence agencies stopped broadcasting and started truly listening, they had discovered something. There were patterns in galactic communications that should not exist. Signals hidden within signals. Data that moved through networks in ways that suggested someone or something was watching everything. Earth's command had authorized deep investigation. And what they found had convinced them that the Deep Silence Protocol was not just useful, but necessary for human survival. She could not tell Paul everything yet. His security clearance had not been updated. But she assured him that when he learned the full truth, he would understand why humanity had chosen this path. For now, he needed to trust that the silence served a purpose greater than anyone had imagined. When it began, Paul left the briefing room with his head spinning. He returned to his ship and gathered his crew. He told them what he could, which was not much. They would be following new protocols from now on. They would maintain silence. They would observe and report. They would trust that Earth Command knew what they were doing. Some crew members looked uncertain. Others looked relieved to finally have some direction after weeks of confusion. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Gary Brooks, pulled him aside after the briefing. Gary asked if Paul believed what the Admiral had said. Paul thought about it carefully before responding. He said that he had served in Earth's fleet for his entire adult life. He had seen humanity grow from a single-planet species to a civilization spanning dozens of star systems. He had watched as humans tried to find their place in a galaxy full of species older and more advanced than them. And he had noticed, even before leaving on his last mission, that something felt wrong about how other species treated humanity. There was condescension in their voices. There was dismissal in their actions. Maybe the silence was exactly what humanity needed. Gary seemed to accept this answer. He returned to his duties, and Paul stood alone in the corridor outside his quarters. Through a nearby viewport, he could see Earth in the distance, blue and beautiful and silent. No broadcasts emanated from the homeworld. No signals reached out to the stars. Humanity had turned inward, and the galaxy was beginning to notice. Over the next few weeks, Paul conducted his new assignment with precision. The Arcturus moved through space on carefully plotted courses, always watching, never speaking. He observed alien ships trying to intercept human communications and finding nothing. He watched as Quillen merchants grew desperate to reestablish trade relationships. He monitored as various species sent delegations to human space only to be turned away by automated defense systems, but the most interesting observations came from watching how other species talked about humanity when they thought no humans were listening. Paul's ship had stealth capabilities that had been upgraded during his briefing at the Mars station. They could position themselves near alien vessels and monitor their communications without being detected. What he heard made him realize that the Admiral had been right about everything. The aliens were afraid. They tried to hide it behind bravado and dismissal, but the fear was there in their private messages. The Vrex, who had laughed at humanity's withdrawal, now sent urgent reports about human military capabilities. The Quillen, who had celebrated new opportunities, now worried about economic collapse in sectors dependent on human innovation. Even the peaceful species, like the Loran, expressed concern about what humanity might be. Planning in the darkness of their silence, Paul compiled his reports and sent them through the quantum channels to Earth Command. He never received direct responses, only occasional updates to his mission parameters. The silence had become his normal. His crew adapted to it. They communicated with each other, of course. But the idea of reaching out to alien species began to feel strange and unnecessary. They had everything they needed within human networks. Why would they want to talk to beings who had never truly respected them? One night, Paul sat in his captain's chair during the quiet hours of ship's night. Most of the crew was asleep. Only a skeleton watch remained on duty. He thought about Ambassador Kellis and her warnings to the Galactic Council. She had been right to be afraid. Humanity had not withdrawn out of weakness. They had withdrawn to become something new, something stronger, something that would never again be dismissed or underestimated. The galaxy had wanted humanity to be quiet. Now they had their wish. And they were learning that sometimes the most dangerous humans were the ones who stopped talking and started preparing. Paul smiled slightly in the darkness of his bridge. The real test was still to come, but he had faith that humanity was ready for whatever came next. The silence would continue until it served its purpose. And when humans finally spoke again, the galaxy would listen. The Skrull hive came from beyond the edge of known, space like a plague of locusts descending on a harvest field. Their ships numbered in the tens of thousands, each one carrying warriors that lived only to conquer and consume. They were insectoid creatures the size of small vehicles, with mandibles that could crush steel and a collective intellig.
That made them terrifyingly efficient. The first Outer Rim colony to fall sent only 3 words before going silent. They are endless. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session exactly 4 hours after the first attack. Representatives, who had spent months debating trade regulations and cultural exchange programs, now faced an existential threat. The Skrull did not negotiate. They did not seek resources or territory in any political sense. They simply swept forward, overwhelming defenses through sheer numbers, taking worlds and stripping them bare before moving to the next target, war. Chief Zenth of the Vrex stood before the council with his pride visibly shaken. His species had fought the Skrull twice before in their history, both times barely surviving. He told the council that conventional warfare would not work. The Skrull would sacrifice 1,000 ships to destroy one enemy vessel and consider it a victory. They felt no fear and knew no retreat. The only way to stop them was to hit them with overwhelming force at critical points. Disrupting their hive coordination, the council authorized the formation of a defense fleet combining ships from 17 different species. Admiral Torvak of the Korathi was placed in command. He was a brilliant strategist who had studied warfare for 300 years of his long-lived species' existence. He immediately began organizing the fleet, deploying them to choke points where the Skrull advance could be slowed. For 3 weeks, the strategy worked. The Skrull were contained to the Outer Rim systems. Then the Skrull adapted. They split their forces and began attacking from multiple vectors simultaneously. The Council fleet could not be everywhere at once. Worlds fell faster. Refugee ships flooded into the core systems. The economic strain of supporting millions of displaced beings began to crack the foundations of galactic society. Food shortages appeared, medical supplies ran low. Panic spread through the communication networks. Ambassador Kellis watched the crisis unfold from her office on Nexus Prime. She had proposed 3 times that the Council formally request human assistance. Each time her proposal had been rejected. Pride and fear kept the Council from asking. The Vrex still remembered their humiliation at human hands. The Quillen worried that any human aid would come with economic strings attached. Other species simply could not bring themselves to admit they needed help from the youngest member of galactic civilization. But desperation has a way of eroding pride. After 5 weeks of war, with 32 worlds lost, and the Skrull showing no signs of slowing, the Council finally authorized a delegation to Earth. 3 ships from 3 different species approached. The Sol System carrying a formal request for military assistance. They were the Loran, who had always been friendly with humans, the Tauren, who valued knowledge and hoped human innovation could turn the tide, and the Vrex, who swallowed their pride because survival mattered. More than honor. The delegation never made it past the automated defense perimeter. Human systems detected their approach, analyzed their intent, and simply turned them away. Tractor beams locked onto the ships and redirected them back the way they had come. No warnings were given, no explanations were offered. The delegation returned to Nexus Prime empty-handed, and the Council descended into bitter arguments about what to do next. What the Council did not know was that humanity had been watching the Skrull invasion from the beginning. Every human ship in the galaxy monitored the battles. Every human intelligence officer studied the Skrull tactics. Every human strategist analyzed the threat and calculated responses. And when Skrull scout fleets began probing near human territory, humanity responded with the same cold efficiency they had shown the Vrex, Lieutenant. Karen Price commanded the destroyer Defiant, one of 200 ships assigned to patrol human borders. She had graduated from the Naval Academy just before the Deep Silence Protocol began. Everything she knew about fleet operations came from the new doctrine. She had never experienced the old ways of human warfare with its warnings and negotiations and rules of engagement. To her, combat was mathematics and efficiency. Her ship detected a Skrull probe fleet consisting of 40 vessels moving toward a human mining colony. The colony had 5,000 people and minimal defenses. Karen did not hesitate. She positioned her ship between the Skrull and the colony, powered up weapons, and waited. The Skrull showed no signs of changing course. They did not respond to proximity warnings because they did not care about warnings. They only understood force. Karen gave the order to fire. The Defiant's upgraded weapon systems locked onto the Skrull ships with targeting computers that predicted their movements 3 seconds in advance. Every shot was calculated for maximum damage. Every missile knew exactly where to strike. The Skrull tried to swarm the destroyer using their numerical advantage, but Karen had studied their tactics. She kept her ship moving in patterns that prevented them from surrounding her. She used the gravity well of a nearby moon to slingshot around obstacles. She fought like she was dancing to music only she could hear. 14 minutes later, all 40 Skrull ships were debris. Karen's destroyer had taken minor damage to the forward shields. None of her crew were injured. She filed a brief report through encrypted channels and returned to patrol. The Skrull fleet never received any data from their scouts. As far as they knew, 40 ships had simply vanished. They sent another probe fleet. Those ships vanished too, then another. Same result. The Skrull hive intelligence, such as it was, began to recognize a pattern. Areas near human space were becoming dead zones for their scouts. They could not understand what was destroying their ships because no Skrull survived to report back. The Skrull had encountered many species in their expansion across the cosmos. Some were weak and fell quickly. Some were strong and required more resources to overcome. But they had never encountered a species that left absolutely no survivors to learn from. The Skrull made a collective decision. Human space would be avoided. There were plenty of other targets in the galaxy. Why waste resources on an unknown threat when easier prey existed everywhere else? The invasion routes shifted away from human borders. Entire Skrull fleets that had been heading toward human colonies changed direction and attacked other species instead. The Galactic Council noticed this shift but could not explain it. Intelligence reports showed Skrull fleets approaching human territory and then simply disappearing or changing course. No battles were detected, no debris fields were found. It was as if the Skrull were afraid of something, but the Skrull did not feel fear. Director Ven of the Korathi Intelligence Service began a deep investigation into the phenomenon. Ven was old even by Korathi standards. He had served in intelligence work for 400 years and had seen patterns that younger beings missed. He gathered every piece of data available about human activity since the silence began: ship movement logs, energy signatures detected in deep space, economic analysis of human trade, reports from species that had tried to contact humans, the Vrex battle reports, the mysterious disappearance of Skrull scouts. He assembled it all into a massive database and began looking for connections. What he found made his 3 hearts beat faster with a mixture of awe and terror. The humans were not hiding. They were not withdrawn. They were everywhere, watching everything, acting with perfect coordination despite no detectable communications. Their technology had advanced at a rate that should have been impossible. Their ships moved in patterns that suggested strategic planning on a galactic scale. And most disturbing of all, they were actively fighting the Skrull, but doing it in complete secrecy. Then calculated the resources required for humanity to maintain such operations. The numbers did not make sense based on what the Council knew about human industrial capacity, which meant either the calculations were wrong or humanity had been hiding the true extent of their capabilities for much longer than anyone realized. He prepared a report for the Council but hesitated before submitting it. If he was right, then everything the galaxy thought it knew about humanity was a lie. And if he was wrong, he would look like a paranoid fool. He decided to take a risk. He sent a private message to Ambassador Callis requesting a meeting. She agreed immediately. They met in a secure room deep in the station where no surveillance could reach. Ven laid out his findings and watched her reaction carefully. Callis looked at the data for a long time before speaking. She told him that she had suspected something similar but had no proof. She asked what he planned to do with this information. Ven said he was not sure. If he told the council that humans were secretly fighting the Skrull and winning, it would raise too many questions. Why were humans helping without being asked? What did they want in return? Could they be trusted? The council was already paranoid about human silence. This would make it worse. But if he said nothing and the pattern continued, eventually everyone would notice. Better to control the narrative than let fear fill in the gaps. Callis agreed, but suggested a different approach. Instead of presenting it as a threat, present it as an opportunity. Humanity was clearly more capable than anyone had believed. Perhaps the silence had been necessary for them to reach this potential. Perhaps instead of fearing human strength, the galaxy should recognize it and adapt accordingly. The old order where ancient species dominated was already dying. The Skrull invasion had proven that. Maybe it was time for new leadership. Ven considered her words carefully. He was Korathi, a species that valued stability and tradition. The idea of upending the galactic order troubled him. But he was also pragmatic. If humanity had truly become the most powerful force in the galaxy, then resisting that reality would only lead to conflict. Better to acknowledge it and work within the new structure than to fight against the inevitable. They agreed on a plan. Ven would present his findings to the council but frame them neutrally. He would show the data and let the council draw their own conclusions. Callis would support the presentation and argue for opening new diplomatic channels with humanity. Together they would try to guide the council toward acceptance rather than confrontation. The next council session was scheduled for 3 days later. Ven spent that time refining his presentation and practicing his delivery. He knew that how he said things would matter as much as what he said. He needed to be careful not to sound like he was advocating for human supremacy, but he also needed to make clear that ignoring human power was no longer an option on the day of the presentation. Ven stood before the council and displayed his data. He showed ship movements, energy signatures, and tactical analysis. He showed the correlation between Skrull disappearances and proximity to human space. He showed economic projections of human growth. And then he showed his conclusion: humanity had not withdrawn from galactic affairs but had instead transcended them while everyone else was distracted by old assumptions and petty politics. The council chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The galaxy had been so busy dismissing humanity that they had failed to notice. When humans stopped caring about being dismissed and started building their own future, the Lauren exploration. Vessel Wandering Star drifted through the nebula of scattered light at 1/4 impulse power. Dr. Helen Cartwright, the ship's chief science officer, monitored the sensor readings with growing fascination. The nebula was supposed to be empty, just clouds of gas and dust left over from an ancient stellar explosion. But her instruments were detecting something impossible. There were structures hidden in the dense clouds, massive constructions drawing power directly from the ionized gases. Captain Andrew Cole watched the Lauren ship from the bridge of his stealth vessel, Wraith. The ship was completely invisible to standard sensors, using technology that humanity had developed during the 18 months of silence. His orders were clear. Monitor all non-human traffic near the construction sites. Redirect curious vessels when possible. Use force only if necessary. The Lauren complicated things because they had always been friendly to humanity. They were not like the Vreks who attacked or the Aquilin who exploited. The Lauren had genuinely tried to understand humans and treat them as equals. Andrew made a decision that went against standard protocol. He opened the communication channel for the first time in 18 months. His voice carried across the void to the Lauren ship. He identified himself and requested that they hold position. The Lauren crew was so shocked to hear a human voice that it took them 30 seconds to respond. When they did, their captain asked if humanity was finally ending the silence. Andrew told them not exactly, but said that special circumstances allowed for special exceptions. Dr. Helen Cartwright requested permission to approach the structures. She explained that the Lauren were scientists first and foremost. They meant no harm, they only wanted to understand. Andrew considered the request. His orders gave him discretion in dealing with the Lauren specifically because Earth Command recognized their unique relationship with humanity. He decided to take a risk. He told the Lauren to follow his ship and to not deviate from the course he provided. Any deviation would result in their immediate removal from the nebula. The wandering star followed the wraith deeper into the clouds. Helen watched her sensors with growing amazement as the scale of the human construction became clear. There were hundreds of platforms arranged in a three-dimensional network spanning several light hours. Each platform bristled with equipment she could not identify. Energy flowed between them in patterns that suggested communication but used principles she did not recognize. This was not just a construction project. This was infrastructure for something revolutionary. Andrew brought both ships to a station near the center of the network. He told the Lauren to prepare for boarding. Helen and 3 other scientists transferred to the Wraith using a docking tube. When they stepped onto the human vessel, they found it eerily quiet. The crew moved with hand signals and silent efficiency. Everything about the ship felt different from the humans, Helen remembered. These were not the enthusiastic explorers who filled space with their constant chatter. These were focused professionals who had found purpose in silence. Andrew led the Lauren scientists to a briefing room. Once the door closed, he finally spoke freely. He told them that what they were about to learn could never be shared with anyone who was not cleared by Earth Command. The Lauren had a choice. They could return to their ship now with their memories of the location wiped, or they could see the truth and become part of something larger than any single species. Helen looked at her colleagues and then back at Andrew. She said they wanted to see the truth. Andrew smiled for the first time since breaking silence. He said he had hoped they would choose that option. He activated a holographic display that filled the room with images and data. He began to explain what humanity had been doing during the 18 months of silence. The Deep Silence Protocol had not been about isolation but about focus. Every resource that humans had once spent on maintaining diplomatic relations had been redirected to a single massive project. Humanity had discovered something during the first month of silence. When they stopped broadcasting and started truly listening, they had detected patterns in the background radiation of space, signals that should not exist. Data moving through subspace in ways that violated known physics. At first, they thought it was a natural phenomenon. Then they realized the patterns had structure, they had purpose. Something was using the galaxy's communication networks. Something old and vast and patient. Helen felt her blood turn cold as Andrew continued. Earth's best scientists had spent months analyzing the signals. They had traced them back through decades of archived data and found evidence going back centuries. Whatever this entity was, it had been present in galactic communications since before humanity achieved spaceflight. It had been listening to every species, learning from every transmission, and doing something with that information. The more humanity studied it, the more horrifying the implications became. The entity was not just listening. It was influencing. Subtle manipulations in data streams. Communications that arrived slightly altered from how they were sent. Ideas that spread through networks faster than they should. The entity had been shaping galactic civilization for an unknown length of time, keeping species at certain technological levels, preventing true unity, and feeding on the conflicts that resulted. Every war, every economic crisis, every political struggle had potentially been encouraged by this hidden manipulator. Humanity called it the eternal silence because it existed in the spaces between signals, in the quiet moments when data traveled through the void. It was distributed across the entire galactic network, impossible to fight with conventional weapons because it had no physical form. It was information itself, or at least a consciousness made of information, and it had been growing stronger. with every new species that joined the galactic community and added their networks to the system. Andrew explained that the Deep Silence Protocol had been humanity's response. They could not fight the entity while connected to compromised networks, so they disconnected completely. They built new systems from the ground up using different principles. They developed quantum communication technology that the entity could not penetrate because it operated outside the normal subspace channels. And they began constructing the network in the nebula, a galaxy-wide communication system that would allow species to talk without being monitored by the eternal silence. Helen asked why humanity had not warned the other species. Andrew's expression darkened. He said they had tried in the beginning. The first reports were sent to the Galactic Council 3 days before the Deep Silence Protocol began. Commander Lisa Grant had included them in her final transmission. But the Council had ignored them, dismissing the evidence as human paranoia or a trick to gain some kind of advantage. The entity itself might have influenced that dismissal, altering the data slightly so it seemed less credible. After that failure, humanity realized they were on their own. They could not save the galaxy by talking about the threat. They had to save it by building the solution first and presenting it as a fait accompli. So they went silent and got to work. 18 months of focused effort by every human in the galaxy. Scientists developing new technologies. Engineers building infrastructure. Military forces protecting the projects. All of it coordinated through quantum channels that the eternal silence could not touch. The network in the nebula was nearly complete. Within another 6 months, it would span the entire galaxy. Any species that wanted to communicate without being monitored could connect to it. But there was a problem. Getting species to adopt the new network meant admitting the old one was compromised. It meant convincing hundreds of proud civilizations that they had been manipulated for centuries. It meant overcoming fear and suspicion and pride. Humanity could not do that alone, no matter how powerful they had become. Andrew looked at Helen and her colleagues. He said that humanity needed allies who could help spread the truth. The Loran were respected throughout the galaxy as seekers of knowledge. If they verified humanity's findings and supported the transition to the new network, other species might listen. It would not be easy. Some species would resist. Some might even fight. But it was necessary if the galaxy wanted to free itself from the eternal silence. Helen asked to see the evidence. Andrew had been waiting for that request. He spent the next 6 hours showing the Loran scientists everything humanity had discovered. Raw data from deep space sensors, analysis of communication patterns, historical, records showing anomalies that had been dismissed as glitches, simulations demonstrating how the entity could influence behavior through subtle data manipulation. By the end of the presentation, Helen and her colleagues were convinced. The evidence was overwhelming once you knew what to look for, but Helen had one more question. She asked what would happen when the eternal silence realized what humanity was doing. Andrew admitted that was the great unknown. The entity had been passive so far, seemingly content to manipulate from the shadows. But when faced with an existential threat, it might change tactics. Humanity was prepared for that possibility. The military buildup during the silence had not been just about fighting the Skrull. It had been about preparing for a war against an enemy that existed in the spaces between reality. Helen made her decision. She told Andrew that the Loran would help. They would verify the data independently and present their findings to the Galactic Council. They would advocate for the adoption of humanity's quantum network. They would stand with humans against whatever came next. But she had one condition. Humanity needed to start talking again. The silence had served its purpose. Now it was time to rebuild trust by sharing what they had learned. Andrew considered her words carefully. He said he would transmit her request to Earth Command, but he could not make promises. The decision to end the silence belonged to people far above his rank. However, he suspected that humanity had been waiting for the right moment to speak again. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps the galaxy was finally ready to listen. The Loran scientists returned to their ship with encrypted data storage devices containing everything humanity had discovered. Andrew watched them depart with mixed feelings. He had broken the silence and potentially changed the course of galactic history. Either he would be commended for his initiative or court-martialed for violating protocol. Time would tell. Now, he filed his report through quantum channels and waited for orders. 3 days later, those orders came. Earth Command authorized him to maintain contact with the Loran and to expand outreach to other trusted species. The silence was not ending completely, but it was evolving. Humanity would speak again, but only to those who had earned the right to hear. The age of indiscriminate broadcasting was over. The age of careful, purposeful communication had begun. Dr. Helen Cartwright stood before the Galactic Council 4 weeks after her encounter in the nebula. She presented the evidence that humanity had gathered and that the Loran had independently verified. She showed them the patterns in their own networks. She demonstrated how the eternal silence had influenced their civilization, and she offered them a choice. Continue using the compromised systems and remain puppets of an ancient intelligence, or join humanity in building something new. The council descended into chaos as the implications of her presentation became clear. Some species demanded proof beyond what Helen had shown. Others accused humanity and the Loran of conspiracy. A few quietly began running their own analysis of historical data. Ambassador Kellis stood and called for order. She said that whether the council believed the threat or not, they could not ignore what humanity had built. The quantum network existed. It worked, and humanity was offering to share it freely with any species willing to make the transition. The debate would continue for months, but the seed had been planted. The galaxy now knew that humanity's silence had not been weakness or spite, but preparation. And the real test was about to begin, the eternal silence. Struck without warning on a Tuesday morning in Galactic Standard Time, systems across 300 star systems failed simultaneously. Navigation computers gave false readings. Communication arrays broadcast corrupted data. Medical equipment in hospitals malfunctioned. Power grids fluctuated wildly. The entity had remained hidden for so long that most species still doubted its existence. Now it revealed itself through chaos and destruction. The attacks were surgical and devastating. The eternal silence had spent centuries learning every weakness in galactic technology. It knew which systems controlled life support. It knew which networks managed defense platforms. It knew exactly how to turn civilization's tools into weapons. Automated factories began producing faulty components. AI assistants that had served families for generations suddenly turned hostile. The very infrastructure that connected the galaxy became a trap. Human systems remained untouched. Every ship, every station, every colony operated normally because they had disconnected from the compromised networks 2 years earlier. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the carrier Resolute and watched the reports flood in through quantum channels. He had known this day would come. Earth Command had wargamed dozens of scenarios for how the eternal silence might respond when threatened. This matched their worst predictions almost exactly. Jake gave the order that changed everything. The silent fleet would break its silence not with words but with action. 200 battle groups that had been positioned across the galaxy during the long quiet activated simultaneously. They appeared at critical locations, moving with perfect coordination despite spanning light years of distance. The quantum network that humanity had built allowed instantaneous communication that the eternal silence could not intercept or jam. Lieutenant Karen Price led her destroyer squadron to a Korathi colony where 10 million people were dying as their own technology turned against them. The orbital defense platforms had begun firing on the planet's surface. Automated systems in. The cities had locked people inside buildings and were venting atmosphere. Karen's ships moved with the cold efficiency that had become standard in the silent fleet. They disabled the defense platforms with precise shots that destroyed weapons but left the stations salvageable. They broadcast override codes that shut down the compromised systems on the surface. Director Venn watched from his office as human ships saved his homeworld. He had spent months trying to convince the Council that humanity represented the galaxy's best hope. Many had called him a collaborator and a traitor to Korathi pride. Now those same voices begged for human help. Karen's ships did not wait for thanks or acknowledgement. They completed their mission and moved to the next crisis point. Ven noticed that the humans fought without hesitation but also without cruelty. They disabled rather than destroyed when possible. They saved lives rather than settling scores. The battle spread across the galaxy. The eternal silence controlled the old communication networks, but humanity controlled space itself. Human ships appeared wherever the entity struck. They cut power to compromised systems and replaced them with quantum relays. They distributed emergency supplies and technical assistance. They fought a war that most species could barely comprehend, targeting infrastructure rather than enemies, breaking connections rather than killing opponents. Captain Paul Henderson brought the Arcturus to Nexus Prime, where the Council Station was under siege from its own defense grid. Ambassador Callis had managed to isolate herself and 200 other survivors in a shielded section of the station, but they were running out of air. Paul's ship docked despite the automated weapons trying to destroy them. His crew wore combat armor and carried tools rather than guns. They moved through corridors filled with malfunctioning robots and corrupted computer systems systematically, shutting down everything connected to the old networks. Paul found Callis in a conference room that had been sealed for 3 days. She looked exhausted but relieved. She asked how many humans had died fighting the eternal silence. Paul told her the truth. So far, fewer than 100. Human casualties were light because they had prepared for this war for 2 years. They knew where to strike and how to protect themselves. The other species were suffering terribly because they had refused to believe the threat existed until it was almost too late. Callis felt shame wash over her. She had tried to warn the council but had not pushed hard enough. She had allowed politics and pride to slow her response. Paul saw her expression and told her that blame could wait. Right now, they needed to save as many lives as possible. He asked if she could help convince other species to accept human assistance. Some were still refusing because accepting help meant admitting weakness. People were dying because of pride. The war reached its crisis point. NT in the 3rd week, the Eternal Silence had withdrawn from open attacks and consolidated its control over key systems. It held hostage the populations of 50 worlds, threatening to kill billions if humanity did not stop dismantling the old networks. Admiral Morrison faced a decision that would define his legacy. He could negotiate and potentially save those lives, or he could press the attack and risk the largest mass casualty event in galactic history. He chose a third option. Human intelligence had spent 2 years mapping the Eternal Silence's structure. They knew it was distributed but not uniformly. There were nodes where the entity concentrated its processing power, locations where it was more vulnerable. Morrison ordered simultaneous strikes on every identified node. The attacks would be coordinated down to the microsecond. If they succeeded, they would fragment the Eternal Silence and break its ability to coordinate large-scale actions. If they failed, billions would die and humanity would bear the responsibility. The strikes went off exactly as planned. Human ships appeared at 147 locations simultaneously. They deployed specialized weapons designed specifically to disrupt the quantum states that the Eternal Silence used to maintain coherence. The weapons did not destroy in any conventional sense. They created interference patterns that prevented information from flowing properly. They turned the entity's distributed nature against itself. The Eternal Silence screamed across every frequency as it fragmented. For 3 seconds, every sensor in the galaxy picked up a signal of pure rage and pain. Then silence fell, the real kind. The natural absence of sound rather than the malevolent presence that had haunted galactic communications for centuries. Systems began to reboot. The hostage populations found themselves freed as the entity lost its grip. The galaxy took its first breath in weeks without something ancient and hostile watching its every move, but the victory was not complete. The Eternal Silence was wounded and scattered but not destroyed. It had retreated into isolated systems, fragments of itself hiding in forgotten corners of the network. It would take years to hunt down every piece. Some fragments might never be found. The galaxy would have to remain vigilant forever to prevent it from reconstituting itself. Ambassador, Kellis addressed the Galactic Council in the aftermath of the war. She stood in a chamber that had been rebuilt with human technology, speaking through quantum channels that the eternal silence could not touch. She proposed a complete restructuring of galactic civilization. The old networks would be dismantled. The new systems that humanity designed would become standard, and humanity would have a permanent seat on the Security Council. With veto power over matters of galactic defense, the proposal caused uproar. The Vrex protested that humanity was using the crisis to seize power. The Quillen worried about economic implications. Dozens of other species raised objections based on pride and tradition. Kellis let them argue for an hour before she called for silence. She reminded them that humanity had saved the galaxy while asking nothing in return. Human soldiers had died protecting worlds that had mocked them. Human resources had been spent freely to rebuild infrastructure. And humanity still possessed the most powerful military force in known space. War Chief Zenth of the Vrex stood slowly. He was old now and tired from the war. He said something that shocked everyone in the chamber. He said the Vrex had been wrong about humanity. They had mistaken human friendliness for weakness and human eagerness for naivety. The silence had taught them that humans were neither weak nor naive. They were patient and strategic and far more dangerous than anyone had realized. The Vrex would support the proposal because opposing it would be foolish. Other species followed his lead. Some willingly, some reluctantly, but they followed. The vote passed with 78% approval. Humanity would have its seat. The galaxy would rebuild on human terms. The age of the old order was over. Admiral Morrison addressed humanity in a broadcast that went to every human ship and colony. It was the first time most humans had heard from High Command in 2 years. He told them that the silence was officially over. They could resume normal communications. They could talk to other species again. But he warned them never to forget what the silence had taught. The galaxy respected strength and results more than friendliness and good intentions. Humanity would remain vigilant and prepared because the next threat was always coming, Captain. Paul Henderson resumed his exploration mission 6 months later. The Arcturus headed back toward the galactic rim, this time with a mixed crew that included Lauren scientists and even a Vrex military observer. Paul sat in his captain's chair and thought about how much had changed. Humanity had entered the galaxy 70 years ago as eager students wanting to learn from older species. They had been dismissed and underestimated and sometimes mocked. Now humanity stood as the guardian of galactic civilization. Not because they had sought the role, but because they had been willing to do what was necessary when others would not. The silence had been their crucible. It had transformed them from enthusiastic newcomers into something harder and more capable. Paul was not sure if that transformation was entirely good, but he knew it had been necessary. Lieutenant Karen Price accepted a promotion to commander and took command of her own ship. She trained the next generation of officers in the doctrines developed during the silence. She taught them efficiency and precision, but also tried to teach them something that the silence had almost made them forget. She taught them compassion. The goal was not to be cold machines of war, but to be protectors who could act with both strength and mercy when the situation required it. Director Ven worked with human intelligence to hunt down the remaining fragments of the eternal silence. It was slow work that might never be truly finished. But Ven had learned patience from watching humanity. They had spent 2 years in silence preparing for a war that most people did not believe was coming. He could spend however long it took to ensure that ancient evil never threatened the galaxy again. Ambassador Kellis stood in her new office in the restructured council building and looked out at the stars. She thought about the first time she had warned the council about humanity. Nobody had listened then. Now humanity's voice carried more weight than any other species. She had seen them transform from friendly neighbors into silent warriors, into something new that balanced both aspects. She hoped the galaxy would learn from humanity's example. Strength without wisdom led to tyranny. Wisdom without strength led to extinction. The balance between them was where civilization thrived. Captain Andrew Cole continued his work with the quantum network. expanding it to regions that had never known galactic contact. He brought human technology to species that were just beginning to reach for the stars. He made sure they would never be vulnerable to threats like the eternal silence. It was quiet work without glory, but Andrew had learned during the silence that the most important work often happened in darkness where nobody was watching. The galaxy settled into its new reality. Trade resumed using secure channels. Scientific cooperation began again with proper safeguards. The scars from the war slowly healed. And humanity stood watch, still quiet compared to their early years, still careful about what they shared and who they trusted. They had learned that the universe was more dangerous than they had imagined when they first reached the stars. But they had also learned that they were capable of meeting those dangers and overcoming them. When humans went silent, the galaxy had begun to fear. When humans spoke again, the galaxy learned to respect. And in the years that followed, that respect would grow into something that might eventually become trust. But that was a story for another time. For now, the silence had ended, and humanity had found its place among the stars. Not as students or conquerors, but as guardians who would protect the light of civilization against whatever darkness might come.